Okay. Now, development of male gametophyte. Upper layer consists of exine, interior to it entine, germ pore and nucleus. That is the structure of pollen grain. So each pollen grain is unicellular, uninucleate, spherical or oval haploid structure. It is with double layered wall called as sporoderm. The outer layer of pollen wall is thick, highly resistant and is called as exine. Okay, it's called as exine. The outer layer of pollen grain is called as exine. The exine may be spiny. Exine is composed of a substance called as sporulin, which produces resistance to a pollen grain from physical and biological decomposition. Okay, exine is interrupted at one or more places, which looks like small pores called as germ pore. In monocots, it is uniporate, that is single germ pore. Okay. So the pollen grains are mostly uniporate, that means single germ pore in monocots, and triporate, that means 3 germ pores in dicots. The inner layer is called as intine. Intine is composed of cellulose and pectin. It encloses protoplasm with single haploid nucleus. Okay, so that was about the structure of pollen grain. Now, let's see the other one. What happens next? So, let's quickly revise. Male gametophyte, development of male gametophyte takes place inside the pollen grain. So the first point, development takes place inside the pollen grain. Next point, you will explain the structure of pollen grain. Draw the diagram of pollen grain. Tell what is exine. Exine is the outer layer. It is made up of sporopollen. Inner intine, made up of cellulose and pectin. Exine is interrupted by germ pore. In monocot, germ pore is uniporate, and in dicot, it is triporate. Okay. Then next, it is endosporic. Male gametophyte is endosporic. It involves 2 mitotic division. It has 2 stages. First one is pre-pollination, which takes place in pollen sac, and the other one is post-pollination, which happens on the stigma. Okay, so the development of male gametophyte involves 2 mitotic division. It has 2 stages. The first one is pre-pollination, which takes place in pollen sac, and the second one is post-pollination, which takes place on the stigma. Now, look at this. Anther. Okay, this is the anther. Anther में क्या होता है? Pollen grain होता है. That pollen grain falls on the stigma. तो फर्स्ट स्टेज में क्या है? फर्स्ट स्टेज बोलेगा तो प्री पॉलिनेशन या बिफोर पॉलिनेशन, जो पोलन सैक के अंदर होता है. दूसरा है पोस्ट पॉलिनेशन, जो स्टिग्मा, जब पोलन ग्रेन स्टिग्मा पर गिरता है, दैट इज कॉल्ड एज पोस्ट पॉलिनेशन. Where does it takes place? It takes place on the stigma. Look at the diagram. So when it takes place on the stigma, it is called as post pollination. Okay. Now let's see the first stage, which is pre-pollination. We know how the pollen grain looks like. तो प्री पॉलिनेशन बोलेगा तो क्या, पोलन सैक के अंदर, पॉलिनेशन के पहले, बिफोर पॉलिनेशन, व्हाट हैपेंस, दिस न्यूक्लियस गेट्स डिवाइडेड इनटू टू. ओके, फर्स्ट वन इज द जनरेटिव सेल एंड द सेकेंड वन इज द ट्यूब सेल. सो व्हाट हैपेंस, द पोलन ग्रेन्स divide mitotically to form two unequal cell. The smaller cell is called as generative cell and it has a larger nucleus. It lacks reserve food and vacuole. The larger cell is vegetative or tube cell. Okay, so the smallest cell is called as generative cell. It has a large nucleus and it lacks reserve food and vacuole. So जो generative cell है, it has a larger nucleus. This generative cell lacks reserve food and vacuole. Okay, and it has a tube cell. It has a large vacuole and nucleus and it also has reserve food. The generative cell lacks a definite cell wall and they are freely suspended in cytoplasm of vegetative cell. Okay, now this generative cell divides by mitosis to form two male gametes and therefore three-celled pollen grains are released from anther. Look over here. Pre-pollination से सबसे पहला two-celled हो जाता है, generative cell form होता है और tube cell बनता है. Okay, it undergoes mitotic division. Pollen grain divides mitotically to form two unequal cells, generative cell and tube cell. So at this stage the pollen grain is two-celled. Okay, two-celled pollen grain. Generative cell lacks reserve food and vacuole. Tube cell contains large vacuole, nucleus and reserve food. Okay, now this is enough for pre-pollination in the pollen sac. And at the end we shall revise how to write the answer. Now I hope till here you have understood. Okay, let's have a quick recap. Development of male gametophyte. It involves two mitotic division. It has two stages, pre-pollination and post-pollination. प्री-पॉलिनेशन में क्या होता है? प्री-पॉलिनेशन में the pollen grain divides mitotically to form two unequal cell, generative cell and tube nucleus or tube cell. Generative cell lacks reserve food and vacuole. Tube cell consists of large vacuole, cytoplasm, nucleus and reserve food. Okay. Now let's see post-pollination. Post-pollination, or it is also called as after pollination. After pollination, when does it occur? When the pollen grain falls on the stigma. Okay. What happens when the pollen grain falls on the stigma? After pollination, two-celled pollen grain is deposited on stigma. So if you look over here, ये two-celled pollen grain, look at the diagram. The two-celled pollen grain gets deposited on the stigma. यहाँ पर post pollination शुरू होता है. So जब two-celled pollen grain deposits on the stigma, it comes in contact with sugary stigmatic secretions and absorbs it. Due to this, the volume of cytoplasm increases and creates pressure which acts on the intine. The intine of pollen grain comes out of the germ pore in the form of a tube called pollen tube. The tube nucleus, cytoplasm and generative cell migrate into pollen tube. The pollen tube grows down towards ovule through the style due to chemical stimulus inside ovary. The generative cell divides by mitosis in the pollen tube to form two haploid non-motile male gametes. This pollen tube with two male gametes, thin cytoplasm and a degenerating sterile vegetative nucleus represents male gametophyte. Okay, look at the diagram. Two-celled pollen grain before pollination in the pollen sac. Second step में क्या होता है? Second stage, pollination on the stigma. ये pollen tube सोलन होता है. Generative cell pollen tube के अंदर आता है. फिर ये generative cell gets divided into two non-motile haploid male gametes. Okay, so you can see in the diagram, this a solen tube is formed. Generative cell divides into two male gamete which are haploid non-motile. Okay, so this entire structure which shows intine, exine, two male gametes, pollen tube. So this is called as tube. This is called as male gametophyte. अगर क्वेश्चन आया, ड्रॉ अ नीट लेबल डायग्राम ऑफ मेल गैमेटोफाइट, क्या ड्रॉ करोगे? यू विल ड्रॉ दिस डायग्राम. जहाँ पे ये एक्साइन दिख रहा है, इंटाइन दिख रहा है, टू मेल गैमेट, वहाँ पे लिखो टू मेल गैमेट नॉन मोटाइल, पोलन ट्यूब, दिस इज ऑल्सो कॉल्ड एज पोलन न्यूक्लियस, सॉरी दिस पोलन ट्यूब न्यूक्लियस. सो ये दो मेल गैमेट विच आर नॉन मोटाइल and tube nucleus forms male gametophyte. Okay, look at this diagram. So this shows the stages of male gametophyte. Okay, so the question is, let's have a quick recap. The question is development of male gametophyte. Okay, so the development of male gametophyte is dash. It is endosporic. That is, it occurs within the microspore. It it occurs within the pollen grain. Pollen grain बोलेगा तो क्या? Microspore. Okay, pollen grain बोलेगा तो क्या? Microspore. Okay, so it occurs within the microspore. It involves how many? It involves 2 mitotic divisions. It is completed in how many stages? Correct, 2 stages at 2 different places. पहला stage कौन सा है? Before pollination या फिर pre pollination. दूसरा stage कौन सा है? Post pollination या after pollination on the stigma. Before pollination in the pollen sac and after pollination on the stigma. ठीक है, उसके बाद ये 2-celled pollen grain दिखाओगे. You'll show the generative cell and the tube nucleus. Generative cell, tube nucleus and pollen grain. उसके बाद ये वाला diagram, male gametes. Okay, ये generative cell divides mitotically in the pollen tube and forms 2 haploid, 2 non-motile male gametes. So ये जो generative cell है divide होता है mitotically, okay, in the pollen tube और 2 haploid non-motile male gamete form होता है. ठीक है, और ये tube nucleus और there's a tube nucleus. Okay, so this structure is called as male gametophyte.